Today on Inside the Issues, we talk with Kathryn Hochstetler on Brazil as an emerging power. Welcome to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast, a production of the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. I'm David Welch, your host. I'm the CIGI Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. And every week we talk to experts on various global governance issues. I'm joined today by Professor Kathryn Hochstetler of the University of Waterloo, who is also the CIGI Chair of Governance in the Americas. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you.
And today we'll be talking about Brazil as an emerging power. We'll start off by talking a little bit more generally about emerging powers. Let me ask you, first of all, is Brazil an emerging power?
Well, that's a good question, because Brazil has always thought that it is a power, and maybe not even an emerging one. It's a big country. It's the fifth largest country in terms of both population and size. But the piece that's always been missing for Brazil is that the recognition of others that it might be a major power. And this in large part came about in 2001 when Goldman Sachs singled out a set of 4 large countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, as the bricks of a future world economy, and argued that these countries were going to become the major powers of the 21st century, and therefore the powers of the 20th century needed to pay quite a bit more attention to this set of powers. And it's really in the context of that Brazil has come to be more widely recognized as being an emerging power. That's not the same thing as saying that it is a world power, but I think it is very much a country that is looking at its best years in the future, and possibly a fairly near future.
Now, I imagine if you asked most people to name an emerging power, almost everybody would say China. Some people would say India. Some people might say, well, Russia is a declining power rather than an emerging one. But how many people would actually think, just spontaneously, oh, Brazil is an emerging power?
I think most people in the world would probably not think of Brazil inherently as an emerging power. But certainly if you're in Latin America, you do, because Brazil is by far and away one of the largest powers of Latin America. It already has been the 8th to the 10th largest economy globally, and in the region is very much a dominant economic power, the economic center to which many people send exports and receive Brazilian manufactured imports and things like that. So in terms of being a regional economic core, it already is that.
And what are some of its key assets? What makes it certainly a regional powerhouse and on a global scale a genuine emerging power? Well,
the size is there, but I think more than the size, you have a number of things that make Brazil an emerging power. Some of them are that it is a tremendously innovative country politically as well as economically, and perhaps politically more than economically. Because when you look at the set of emerging powers, one of the things you notice about powers like China, for example, is that they're authoritarian. And it has made them a particular kind of power in the global system that is perhaps skeptical and sometimes seen as challenging of some of the global rules. Now, Brazil is sometimes called the good brick, in the sense that of the bricks, it's perhaps the least likely to be overtly challenging some of our Western ideals and principles of democracy and human rights protection and things like that. And so it occupies, I think, a special place along with India and South Africa as countries that are major regional powers and democracies, and feel as though they've done a number of things domestically, like reduce their levels of poverty and inequality, that make them countries that really should be looked to more at the global level.
Although India has been a functioning democracy somewhat longer than Brazil has. Is that not true?
That is true. That is true. But India has certain obvious problems with its democracy, like very high levels of violence between different religious groups and different ethnicities, and Brazil doesn't have that. And so I would say of the large emerging democracies, it has one of the best functioning democracies in terms of being one that is quite inclusive and peaceful at the level of different ethnicities and races and religions.
Right. So what are its biggest weaknesses or liabilities?
Well, I've skirted over one of them, which is that while it is quite inclusive politically, it is economically very exclusive. And it typically has had one of the worst inequality rates in the whole world. And while it has now improved over the last decade quite a bit, it is still around the 10th percentile. So 90% of the world's countries still are more equal than Brazil. And you can trace that very directly to some ongoing problems. The Brazilian population is not as well educated as it should be for its level of development. It actually lags most of the other countries of Latin America, for example, even ones that have many fewer economic resources. And generally, there are still a great many Brazilians in very deep poverty.
Very good. Well, we'll be back in just a minute with Kathryn Hochstetler, CIGI Chair of Governance in the Americas. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. You can find us at www.cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. And welcome back. Kathy, let's talk about Brazil and the recent financial crisis, which of course devastated the world economy. On most accounts, it was the single most significant economic crisis since the Great Depression of the late 1920s and early 1930s. Brazil appears to have weathered it tolerably well. What accounts for that?
Well, Brazil actually has a somewhat different profile from some of the other large emerging economies. And probably one of the things that really stands out is that it is not, in fact, as heavily trade dependent as countries like China and other of the emerging powers are. So China, for example, has almost 35 to 40% of its economy in exports, whereas Brazil's dependence on exports is only 10 to 15% of its economy, and its dependence on imports about the same. And so many of the directions in which the countries of the world are trying to push China now in terms of developing stronger domestic demand, Brazil already has. And so it was actually the strength of that very strong demand that Brazil had domestically that allowed it to weather much of this economy. Another part of it is, unlike Mexico, which is another major economic power in Latin America, Mexico sends somewhere between 70 and 80% of its exports to the United States, whereas Brazil sends almost equal amounts, between 20 and 25%, to the United States, to China, to the European Union, and to Argentina. So it has a very, very diversified set of export markets, and that's a smaller part of its economy. The other major piece is that after Brazil had its own currency crisis in 1999, it decided that it was going to begin to accumulate reserves that would allow it to survive any upcoming economic crisis without recourse to the International Monetary Fund and without recourse to the international system generally. And so that meant that it was able actually to finance a great deal of domestic spending, stimulus spending, that allowed it to weather the crisis really quite well.
So they had a war chest.
They had a war chest,
Yeah,
exactly.
That's interesting what you just said, because Canada, of course, is highly trade dependent, and in particular highly trade dependent on the United States. And Canada was another country that weathered the financial crisis pretty well, and most people say that's because we had a robust banking system. Now, did Brazil also have a robust banking system?
Brazil also has a robust banking system, and one of the things that's different between it and other Latin American countries is that even after it opened its national banking system to global banks, Brazilian banks, in part because of the size of the country, were large enough that they were able to successfully compete with those banks. And so many of its banks are, in fact, national banks rather than, so it's not as closely tied into the global financial system and the global banks that had so much trouble elsewhere. But part of it is that Brazil has some very healthy national banks, state-owned banks, like the Brazilian National Development Bank, which also increased its spending by a tenfold margin that allowed it to, again, finance a lot of activities and provide some of the kind of fiscal stimulus that helped Brazil to weather this crisis.
Will the crisis have had any important effect on the Brazilian economy or Brazilian politics?
I think in a large sense, one of the things that it has done, and this will have implications beyond Brazil as well, one of the things it has done is for Brazilians, it has given them a strong sense that their way of handling the economy was right, in much the same way that I think Canadians also say to ourselves that the way that we did things over the last decade was clearly the more correct way to do things, because it meant that we didn't have the kind of bubble and fall that other countries did. Well, Brazil is saying very similar things. And the fact that President Lula, who's been president for the last 8 years, the fact that his chosen successor just won re-election by a 10-point margin in October of this year, shows that. Right now in Brazil, it's a politics of continuity. It's a politics of we want to do things the way we've been doing them. And one thing to notice about that is that in many ways, Brazil's done things over the last 10 years that have not been the standard market-oriented kinds of policies. Stockpiling all those reserves, for example, is not something that countries have traditionally been encouraged to do. Or using national development banks and large amounts of government fiscal spending, again, not the policies of the Washington Consensus. And so I think Brazilians will say that what their model shows is having macroeconomic foundations are very useful, but having a more heterodox model that uses the state to do important things in the economy is a model that they can really hold up for the rest of the world and say it really stood up quite well for us in this crisis.
And an emerging power presumably would try to play an emerging power's role in helping to lead the world through a crisis. Did Brazil step up and try to take any leadership role of that kind?
Absolutely, and one of the things that I think will also be a lasting result of this change or this crisis and the response to it is that Brazil and India and China and a small set of other emerging powers have now been given greater seats at the table in the G20, for example. It used to be the 7 richest countries together in the G7. It's now the G20 of countries, and it includes Brazil and these other emerging powers, are now have a seat at the table to make these global decisions. But I think probably even more significantly is a whole series of additional positions in some of the implementation bodies, some of the bodies that set global rules for banks, for example, or for international standards. And Brazil, over the last couple of years, has been given a seat at those too.
Oh, very good. Well, when we come back, I want to talk to you a bit about climate change, but we'll break briefly and be right back with Kathy Hochstetler. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI online podcast. You can find us at www.cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Kathy, Brazil might have been part of the solution when it comes to the international economic crisis, but we tend to think of emerging economies, rapidly developing economies, as part of the problem when it comes to climate change. So let's talk a bit about climate change. What is the role of emerging powers in climate change?
Well, their role right now, whether they want it or not, is to be at the exact center of it. Because when you look at the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases, it is unwilling to participate in any of the current agreements on climate change because there is no provision made in them for emerging powers, including China, India, and Brazil, to have any mandatory requirements for reducing their own emissions. The largest emitter being the United States, right. And so this has really been front and center of the debates about climate change since the Kyoto Protocol was negotiated in 1997, which the U.S. did not sign in good part because these countries were not part of it. And they have insisted that they should not be asked to reduce their emissions now because they haven't developed yet, because they still have billions of poor people in these countries, and that they have historically argued that they have more of a responsibility to bring those people out of poverty than they do to solve a problem that was created by the emissions of the world's current wealthy countries.
So are they just naysayers?
They are not just naysayers. They have made arguments, especially in the most recent Copenhagen conference, the one that happened last December 2009. They, for the first time, I think, were part of trying to talk about how they might be part of a solution.
You were there.
I was there. And watching it over the first couple of days of the conference, these were countries that talked a lot. And one of the things that they began to talk about and then sat down with the United States, and here it was literally Brazil, India, China, and South Africa, and the United States, who sat down and began a set of discussions that became whatever there is as an outcome of the Copenhagen Protocol or the Copenhagen Conference. And basically at this conference, these countries did agree for the first time to make voluntary commitments to reduce their emissions, assuming that the developed countries do so as well. And Brazil was really a leader in this, and it's a kind of interesting story because one of the reasons that the Brazilian government decided that it would try to push for some kind of agreement at this conference, which wasn't finally achieved, but it got closer. And one of the reasons why Brazil would put climate change on the agenda was actually because Brazilian businesses asked them to. There were 3 different Brazilian business groups that organized campaigns to try to get their government to agree to making some kinds of commitment on climate change. And part of that is really about maintaining access to markets. They're worried that countries of the north will begin to put carbon taxes onto the border and things like that that will keep out Brazilian products. But I think it's an interesting story in that it really was, at least in part, driven by Brazilian business saying this is the way the world is going, and we need to be ahead of that and helping to set the rules on that rather than simply saying no to it.
Was any of it related to the particular vulnerability of the Amazon to climate change and awareness in Brazil that that's a great national asset?
Brazilians are aware that it's a great national asset. The question is always national asset for whom, with which to do what. And I would actually say that the most important change that happened with respect to the Amazon for Brazil was not that it suddenly realized it was an important national asset. It's known that for a long time. The military government knew it was an asset that it wanted to use for national development. But what really has happened over the last decade, and again, this is a very important decade in Brazil, is that for the very first time in Brazilian history, Brazil has had sustained economic growth rates while deforestation in the Amazon went down. And that has essentially never happened. Deforestation, as long as they've been tracking deforestation, has only gone down when economic growth goes down.
Right.
But what it suggests is that over the last couple of years, through some fairly concerted government policies that include primarily things like satellite monitoring of forest cover and an increased attention to exactly who owns which pieces of property and are responsible for deforestation, there has been a kind of new surveillance of the Amazon that has really brought down levels of deforestation really for the first time in Brazilian history. And it's one of the things that made Brazil willing now to talk at the international level about bringing forest issues into the climate change discussions. It was never willing to so long as an international agreement would mean making a commitment to which it couldn't comply because it didn't have the domestic capacity. But now that it sees it as having the domestic capacity to make some real choices about levels of deforestation, it's become much more willing to do those efforts.
Giving real meaning to the phrase sustainable development, I guess.
Yes, and I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna. It's not as though there's not really enormous levels of deforestation in the Amazon. It's not as though there's not a lot of quite careless use of resources. And I think for Brazilian environmentalists, the language is often not one of not using the Amazon, but rather one of making sure that when you use its resources, that you use them well and responsibly, and that insofar as the Amazon is destroyed, for example, that it goes to make products that are more useful and environmentally sound than new aluminum beer cans, for example, was an example they always like to give me.
And what are they doing domestically to keep a lid on their greenhouse gas emissions?
Well, they came home from the Copenhagen conference, and that was at the beginning of December, and by Christmas they had a brand new, tough climate change law that, among other things, for example, locks in some of the things on deforestation, but perhaps more importantly does things like after 2014, Brazil will not be building any more thermal-powered electric plants, and in a variety of ways it's really a surprisingly tough new climate change law that they passed within a week of the end of the Copenhagen conference.
Perhaps we in Canada could take a lesson from the Brazilian playbook. We'll be back again in a minute with Kathy Hochstetler. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast. You can find us at www.cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Let's step back a bit now, Kathy, and talk about global governance broadly and Brazil's role. Is Brazil's emergence as a rising power a threat or an opportunity from a global governance perspective?
Well, global governance scholars have given quite a bit of thought of this over the last couple hundred years or even longer as to how it is that an emerging power presents a threat or opportunity for the international system. And a lot of the literature does argue that an emerging power, especially one like China, which has the power to displace a current major power, is a threat, and simply its existence is very much a catastrophe, or at least will mark a period of a great deal of conflict for the international system. We have a lot less global governance theory about what it means to have what I think we now have, which is a series of somewhat smaller powers. China may be that kind of classic emerging power, but what we have in Brazil is we have one among a number of countries that are rising together, and we have less understanding of what it means for them. I said earlier in this interview that Brazil is sometimes known as the good brick, in the sense that it has quite a bit of commitment to both some of our liberal norms as well as a commitment to multilateralism as a way of solving global problems. And so I think among this set of emerging powers, Brazil is among the least likely to be overtly challenging the rules of the system. On the other hand, Brazilians have a strong understanding that many of the rules of the system, including ones that uphold liberal principles, including liberal market principles, are not the only versions of those rules that might exist, and that there are a number of rules, particularly in the global economy, that are more about preserving the power of particular existing powers than they are the only versions of the rules that are possible. And so one of the things that you'll be finding Brazil doing is using its new seats at the table to try to revise some of those kinds of laws that work to the advantage of countries like Canada and the United States and the powers of the 20th century, work less to their advantage and work more to the advantage of Brazil and other countries of the global south.
Now, most people would have thought 10, 15 years ago that a rising power would put its primary efforts into securing, say, a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. Some would argue, I would argue, that that's going to be a hard sell because none of the existing permanent members of the Security Council has a strong incentive to give up any of its influence there and welcome additional new veto players. Is Brazil not so concerned about that? Is it putting its eggs in the G20 basket and assuming that that's where the global governance action will shift?
Brazil is hugely interested in a seat at the United Nations. And in fact, when Obama was in India last week and talked about the possibility that the United States would support India's bid for a permanent seat in the United Nations Security Council, that was front page news in every Brazilian paper for a couple of days. And so Brazilians are actually, this has been an aspiration of theirs, and I would say not just an aspiration of theirs, but they would argue something they deserve for a long, long time. So this is very much at the top of their agenda.
Are they hopeful, though? Arguably, it's not realistic.
I suspect that when it happens, it will happen because it's no longer that important. That it will happen because in a thousand cuts kind of way, global power has been distributed in other forums in ways that diminish the powers of the country that are currently the veto holders. And so I suspect that what will really happen is that if it gains the seat in the United Nations, it will be more a kind of final recognition of power that has already come to it in a number of other forums. And one of the reasons that that's the case is because of the particular rules of the United Nations, where it gives the existing 5 oligopolists the power to rule, effect, or veto whether or not others can enter their small club. And because of that set of rules, I think that change will come there much more slowly than it will come other places.
Now, Canada just, of course, lost a bid for a temporary seat on the UN Security Council, and we were an early member of the G8, still a member of the G20, but I don't think people would argue that we're an emerging power at the moment, possibly the opposite. So what kind of attitude should Canada take towards Brazil and the other BRICS? Should we be welcoming their rise in global governance? Should we be cautious? Should we be attempting to steer it in certain directions?
Well, I do think that in many ways it is the Canadas of the world that will lose with this set of emerging powers, because I think that they will displace the countries like Canada. If you look at some of the arguments about who should get more voting rights in the European Union, for example, it's the small countries of Europe that are really the focal point of that, as in why should they have seats at the table at the IMF when Brazil has so few or China has so few. So I think in that kind of sense it is a zero sum. But in more complicated ways, particularly in the economic sphere, I think Canada has both a lot to fear and a lot to gain from Brazil in particular and the other Latin American countries. One of the things that's quite interesting is that Canada's export profile is almost identical to the Latin American countries. So it in effect competes with the Latin American countries to export fuels and to export grains and a variety of things like that. And in that sense, it is a competitor. On the other hand, what it means is that Canada has very many interests in common with these actors, and in fact has often made common cause with countries like Argentina on the kinds of rules that it would like to see for agricultural exports, or will make cause or could make common cause with some of the oil producers of South America. And so, interestingly, the very facts that make it a competitor in the economic realm also mean that some of the South American countries, and Brazil in particular, are some of its best potential allies because they share so many interests in broader global discussions of economic rules.
Are we paying enough attention to Brazil here in Canada?
Not at all.
Is the world paying enough attention to Brazil?
Brazilians would certainly say not. Brazilians would say there's a long-standing story that they say, which is Brazil is the country of the future and it always will be. But diplomats now will tell you the story and then they will say, actually it looks like maybe the future has finally come. And so certainly from the standpoint of Brazilians, the world and Canada has a lot more to be hearing from them and should be paying a great deal more attention.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating and instructive session on Brazil. This has been Inside the Issues, a CIGI Online podcast, and please join us again every week as we talk to somebody working at the cutting edge of global governance issues. And meanwhile, look for us online at cgionline.org, on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. I'm David Welch. Thanks. See you again.